Hello guys, I'm Gallup and welcome to my ultimate €200 console killing gaming PC build. Now with this build, I'm not trying to tell you guys that you shouldn't get a console, it's just to show you that it is possible to get into PC gaming at a really low affordable price without any major drawbacks while still getting all the added functions that a PC has. I did a bit of research and found out that consoles like PS4 are selling at around €200 used with a controller, so I went and tried to build a better performing PC for around the same price. We are in 2017, so I decided that an SSD for a boot drive is an essential part of the build, even at this price point. With that said, let's get started with all the components. So when you're building a PC at such low cost, I think it's best to go with a pre-built all-in-one system and then upgrade it. So I picked up a BOF computer locally from a guy for €120. It was a fully working system with an i5-2320, an asus P8H81MX motherboard, 6GB of RAM at 1333 MHz, a Radeon HD 6450 1GB graphics card, 500GB hard drive and a DVD drive, plus a 420W LC power supply. All these components were packed in a decently looking BOF ADX case. Also, a clean copy of Windows 10 was already installed on this machine. Next up, I found a listing on eBay where a guy was selling his gainward GTX 670 for €70. I sent him a message saying that I need a decent GPU for a good price and that I can make the payment ASAP. I offered him €45 and 5 minutes later we made a deal for €52. At this point, I knew replacing the power supply is not a question anymore, so I found a guy locally who was selling his older Tagan 430W semi-modular power supply for €30. I noticed that his listing was up for over 6 months, so I offered him €15 and I said I'll come pick it up instantly. He agreed, so I got a 530W power supply with 2 6-pin GPU power connectors for a steal. Next up, I had to upgrade the RAM, but the problem was that the motherboard only had 2 RAM slots and both were already populated. So this is where it gets interesting. I did a bit of research and found out that Radeon HD 6450s are selling at around €20 to €25 on eBay. I also had a spare 420W LC power supply and a 2GB RAM stick at this point, as well as a DVD drive. So I listed those locally for €45 and waited. I ended up buying a 4GB Crucial RAM stick running at 1600 MHz for €15. So the only missing component at this point was the SSD. Again, I did a bit of research and found a guy who was selling his Intel 180GB SSD for €45. We made a deal for €40, which brings us to a €242 total cost. Now, I managed to sell the bundle of unused components I was talking about earlier for €40, which brings us down to €202 total, but I'll talk a bit more about prices later. So if we make a quick recap of all the components that we have, for the CPU we have an i5-2320, that is a second generation i5 processor clocked at 3 GHz with a 3.2 GHz boost clock. This is a quad-core chip that performs about the same as the newer i3 Intel processors, and it will provide plenty of processing power even in modern titles. Next up, we got 2 4GB RAM sticks for a total of 8GB that, even by today's standards, it's totally enough to run all the latest games at 1080p. For the motherboard, we have an asus P8H61MX. This is a totally basic motherboard, but it will support all of our components just fine, and that's basically everything we need. For the graphics card, we have the gainward GTX 670 with 2GB of VRAM. At first I was looking to get a less power hungry card, but That forced me to look at newer models that were selling for more and were performing about the same or even worse. So at the end I decided to stick with a GTX 670 since I got it for a pretty good deal. For larger files we have a Western Digital Blue 500GB hard drive that was installed in the BOF system. And for the fast storage we have an Intel 180GB SSD that won't only serve us as a super fast boot drive, but it will also cut the loading times of our favorite games and programs by a fair margin. Powering our system we got a older Tagan 530 watt semi-modular power supply that will provide plenty of juice for our system to run properly and even allow some room for the future upgrade. Lastly, everything is packed in a decently looking BOF ADX case. Now this is the point where you start building, so grab your nearest screwdriver and take off the side panel. This next step will differentiate between different systems, but mine was super dirty, so I started cleaning. I used a hairdryer to blow off most of the dust and grabbed the screwdriver and started taking things apart. This cleaning process is not an essential part of building a system, but I do recommend it if your system is dusty, since it will give you better looks as well as lower thermals that can expand the lifetime of your components. First up, I removed the graphics card by unscrewing it and pressing down on the latch that is located near the 16X PCIe slot. Next up, I removed the hard drive by simply unplugging both of the SATA cables, unscrewing it and pulling it out. After that, I removed the front panel of the case and pretty much repeated the whole process with the DVD drive. After reinstalling the front case panel, I unplugged both SATA cables as well as PSU cables from the motherboard. Then I unscrewed the 4 screws at the back of the power supply and simply maneuvered it out. Lastly, I removed the motherboard by unplugging the case front panel connectors and removing all the necessary screws. At this point, I was left with an empty case that I can easily clean and work on. I grabbed a towel, wiped out all the dust and removed all the unwanted stickers. After that, I took the motherboard, unplugged the CPU fan connector and removed the cooler by turning and pulling out all 4 latches. I further disassembled the CPU cooler in order to access the extra dust and then cleaned off and reapplied the thermal paste on the CPU. Lastly, I reinstalled the CPU cooler and plugged in the CPU fan header. Next up was the graphics card. I took it apart by simply removing all the necessary screws. I cleaned the heatsink and reapplied the thermal paste as well as I cleaned the fan. Once everything was nice and tidy, I put the GPU back together in a reverse process. At this point, all the components were nice and clean and it was time to start building. First up, I grabbed the motherboard and replaced the 2GB RAM stick with the crucial 4GB one. Next up, I installed the power supply with the fan facing down and secured it with 4 screws at the back of the case. After that, I installed the motherboard by simply aligning the back I/O with the I/O shield and securing it with 6 screws. Next up, we have both of the storage drives. The hard drive was easily slided in its spot and secured with 4 screws, but I had to experiment a bit with the SSD. Since the case didn't have any SSD slots, I used some double-sided tape to secure it above the hard drive. Next up were the SATA cables, which were installed like so. Now it was time to install the graphics card. To do so, you only have to remove one of the PCIe covers on the back of the case, like so, and then slide the GPU into place until you hear a click. At this point, all the components were installed, and it was time to connect all the necessary power cables. First, I plugged in all the modular power cables needed in the PSU, and then I ran the 24-pin and the 4-pin power connector to the motherboard, both of the 6-pin power connectors to the GPU, and I also connected SATA power to the drives. Now I was basically done building. All that was left to do is connect all the front panel audio, USB and other stuff to the motherboard like so. The last thing you can do is grab some zip ties and make this beast look beautiful. And congratulations, you've built yourself a cheap console killing gaming PC that won't break the bank. You probably noticed that I didn't talk about shipping, but I spent 20 euros total on it. Basically, the only two items that were shipped to me were the GPU that I bought on eBay. The shipping cost for that was 17 euros, and the RAM, which was sent to me from over the country for a minimal cost of 3 euros. Now, I didn't add those shipping costs to the total of the build just because I think that by picking up parts locally you can keep those at minimum. Okay guys, this is basically it. I did decide to split this video in two, so benchmarks will be coming out tomorrow. Definitely stay tuned for that. Anyway guys, if you enjoyed, drop a like, that helps a ton. Also don't forget to comment, let me know what you think. Is there something you would like me to do differently? Is there something you would do differently in this build? Is there something you would like to see me change editing wise? Maybe you have a suggestion for a future video, let me know. Also don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the benchmarks tomorrow. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.